Cheers, friend. There is a specific kind of comfort in a movie that has absolutely no artistic pretensions and exists almost entirely to scare you in the dark. Wrong Turn 4, Bloody Beginnings is a masterpiece of that exact, forgotten art, and I know that sounds like an absurd thing to say about a 2011 direct-to-video slasher where college kids wander into an abandoned mental hospital and discover that 3 deformed cannibals have been waiting for them. But stay with me, because this movie is more interesting than its reputation suggests. Not necessarily because it is secretly brilliant, and certainly not because every line of dialogue deserves to be rescued from the snow, but because it captures a very particular moment in horror history that is almost impossible to recreate now. If you were a teenager around 2011, there is a good chance you encountered movies like this in strange places. Maybe it was a DVD sitting in a rental kiosk under a flickering supermarket light. Maybe it was a late-night cable marathon when you were supposed to be asleep. Maybe you downloaded a suspiciously compressed file whose image quality looked like someone had filmed the television with a potato. Maybe you found the movie because the cover promised something outrageous, and at 16, that was enough. You did not need a prestige pedigree. You did not need a famous director. You needed blood, snow, screaming, and the possibility that the movie might show you something you were not supposed to see. That is the cultural space Wrong Turn 4 occupies. It belongs to the final stretch of the physical media horror era, when DVD covers could still function like movie trailers and a franchise did not necessarily need a theatrical audience to survive. The film arrived on DVD and Blu-ray on October 25, 2011. Carrying the 4th chapter of a series that had already transformed from a modest 2003 theatrical horror film into a home video machine. And that transition matters, because when you look at Wrong Turn 4 today, the thing that initially looks like its greatest weakness can also become its most revealing quality. It looks cheap. It feels cheap. Sometimes it behaves like it was assembled from whatever was available before lunch. But the cheapness has a texture, and if you grew up with this era of horror, you recognize it immediately. The image has that cold digital hardness that makes snow look almost blue. Interiors feel dim in a way that is not quite atmospheric cinematography and not quite bad lighting, but somehow becomes both. Skin looks pale beneath fluorescent bulbs. Blood looks aggressively red. Shadows gather in corners that seem too dark for a professionally controlled image. The movie feels like a digital file from a forgotten hard drive, and there is something strangely intimate about that. You remember the glow of the television more than the actual room you were sitting in. You remember the menu music, the plastic case, the little Fox logo, the way the disc loaded and sat there waiting while the house became quieter around you. You remember knowing that everyone else was asleep. That detail is important. Horror changes when you watch it alone at midnight. A movie that would feel ridiculous at 2 in the afternoon can become deeply effective when the only light in the room is coming from the screen. Your imagination starts filling in the spaces between sounds. A hallway in the movie becomes connected to the hallway outside your bedroom. A distant thump in the film suddenly feels like a noise coming from your own house. And Wrong Turn 4 was built for that relationship. It is not asking you to admire its architecture from a comfortable distance. It wants to sit beside you on the couch and keep escalating until you stop caring whether the script makes sense. The original Wrong Turn had a theatrical identity. It had a recognizable cast, a stronger sense of visual scale, and a survival horror premise that could still plausibly be marketed as a mainstream genre movie. But by the 4th entry, the franchise had entered a different ecosystem. This was horror designed for people who were already looking for horror. You were not necessarily discovering it because a multiplex billboard told you to. You were finding it because the title was familiar, the cover looked nasty, and the previous installment had taught you exactly what kind of depravity to expect. That creates a strange form of trust between movie and audience. The film knows what you came for. You know what the film is going to give you. There is almost no pretending otherwise. And that is why the nostalgia feels different from nostalgia for something like a Pixar movie or a superhero blockbuster. Nobody is necessarily remembering Wrong Turn 4 as the movie that changed their life. Instead, people remember where they were when they watched it. They remember who recommended it. They remember the ridiculous deaths they could not believe actually made it into the movie. They remember laughing at something that was supposed to be horrifying. They remember arguing about which character would survive. They remember pausing the movie to get food. They remember the weird little rituals surrounding the film. That is still a cinematic experience. It is simply a less prestigious one. We tend to talk about film history as though it is made entirely from masterpieces, but most people's actual film education is much messier. You learn what editing feels like from a bad action movie. You learn what practical gore looks like from a low-budget slasher. You learn the grammar of suspense by watching a character walk toward a door you know they should never open. You learn genre conventions by seeing the same archetypes appear over and over again until you can predict their deaths before the movie announces them. That is not worthless viewing. It is informal film education. And if Wrong Turn 4 was part of yours, your late-night viewing habits were valid. The movie may not have been prestigious, but the experience was real. More importantly, the film itself is a perfect artifact of a transitional period. It sits between older practical effects horror and a digital production culture that was becoming increasingly dominant. It sits between theatrical franchise filmmaking and an era when streaming would eventually make the distinction between cinema and home entertainment much less important. It sits between the old rental store experience and the algorithmic age where a recommendation can appear before you even know what you want to watch. In 2011, there was still something physical about discovering a horror movie. You could hold it. You could judge it by the cover. You could read the back and decide whether the promise of violence was worth your evening. And that physicality gave low-budget movies an identity. The DVD case was not just packaging. It was a little portal into a world that might be terrible, amazing, or somehow both at once. Wrong Turn 4 understood that world instinctively. Its title already tells you the franchise has become absurdly comfortable with repetition. Bloody Beginnings sounds like a promise that even after 3 movies, the series has somehow found another excuse to revisit the same monsters. Yet that is exactly what makes the film fascinating. It is a movie about beginnings made by a franchise that had already become old enough to need an origin story. It is a prequel designed to explain monsters we already know, while also giving us a new group of disposable victims to watch them destroy. On paper, that is a cash grab. In practice, it becomes something more interesting, a concentrated experiment in what happens when a slasher franchise removes almost everything except its most basic ingredients. Snow. Isolation. A building. A group of young people. 3 monsters. A handful of tools. A body count. That is almost the entire machine. And because the machine is so simple, you can actually see how it works. That cheap plastic case sitting on the shelf was not just a product, it was part of a sprawling, bizarre straight-to-video industrial complex. Let's look at how we got here. Wrong Turn began in 2003 as a theatrical release directed by Rob Schmidt and written by Alan B. McElroy, and its central idea was almost beautifully simple. People take the wrong road, enter an isolated environment, and discover that the landscape belongs to something much worse than they imagined. The original had a specific early 2000s identity. It was a studio-backed horror movie with enough recognizable talent to suggest that this was not merely disposable exploitation. Eliza Dushku led the cast, Desmond Harrington played the central male protagonist, and the film even had Stan Winston involved in creature effects. That is a very different pedigree from what the franchise would eventually become. But horror franchises have a particular talent for surviving beyond the circumstances that created them. Once the first Wrong Turn established the basic brand, the question became less about whether another theatrical movie was necessary and more about whether audiences would keep buying the next one. Wrong Turn 2, Dead End, released in 2007, pushed the series toward a more aggressive, self-aware, gore-driven identity under director Joe Lynch. It was still connected to the original mythology, but the tone was louder and nastier. Then came Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead in 2009, directed by Declan O'Brien, and by that point the franchise had clearly found its home in direct-to-video horror. This was the economic environment where the fourth movie made sense. A direct-to-video film did not have to compete with summer blockbusters for a theatrical audience. It needed to satisfy an existing niche. It needed a recognizable title. It needed a compelling cover. It needed enough gore to make horror fans feel that they were getting what they paid for. And most importantly, it needed to be produced efficiently. That efficiency is the secret hidden underneath the entire movie. When you think of a sequel like Wrong Turn 4 as a cash grab, it is tempting to imagine laziness. But a cash grab can still require serious logistical intelligence. Somebody has to find the location. Somebody has to schedule the actors. Somebody has to build or acquire the effects. Somebody has to figure out how to shoot a snowmobile chase in brutally cold weather. Somebody has to make an abandoned building look like an entire world. Somebody has to turn a $2 million scale production into something that feels bigger on screen. That is where Declan O'Brien becomes important. O'Brien had already directed Wrong Turn 3, and for the fourth film he was given more freedom because the story was a prequel. In interviews around the release, he described being called by Fox with the basic request for another horror film for the following Halloween season. That sentence tells you almost everything about the industrial logic behind this movie. This was not a project that needed years of development. It was a product with a deadline, a recognizable property, and an audience waiting for another dose. O'Brien reportedly began writing in October 2010 and delivered a first draft by Halloween, with the film itself needing to be delivered by June 2011. That is a remarkably compressed timeline, and yet it explains something about the movie's energy. Wrong Turn 4 does not feel like a carefully polished machine. It feels like a machine that has been switched on and told to move. There is a weird momentum to it. Characters appear, relationships are established quickly, someone wanders away, someone gets murdered, the group panics, and then the next death arrives. The movie rarely stops to ask whether it should slow down and develop a character because the production model itself is built around movement toward the next set piece. That can be frustrating if you want a traditional character drama. But if you understand the direct-to-video ecosystem, it becomes legible. The film is not competing to become the definitive statement on human nature. It is competing for 93 minutes of your attention. And that means every part of the movie has to justify its presence. This is where the location becomes the masterstroke. Because if you have a limited budget, the easiest way to make a movie feel expensive is not necessarily to build more sets. It is to find one real location that already looks like it belongs in a horror movie. O'Brien had originally imagined shooting in an old hospital in Bulgaria or Romania, but producers in Winnipeg showed him an abandoned mental health facility in Brandon, Manitoba. The Brandon Mental Health Center had been built in 1910 and had gone out of service decades later, and according to O'Brien, it practically contained everything the script needed. That is the kind of accident that can transform a production. Instead of constructing a fake asylum, the filmmakers found a real abandoned institution with the visual history already embedded in its walls. And then they did something even smarter, they surrounded it with winter. Suddenly the movie had a natural perimeter. The snow became a wall. The storm became a lock. The building became a maze. Most horror movies need to invent reasons why characters cannot simply leave. Wrong Turn 4 gets one for free. It is freezing outside. Visibility is terrible. The roads are inaccessible. The snowmobiles are disabled. And beyond the building there is nothing but white. This is where the film stops being merely another forest slasher and becomes something more specific. Most horror sequels run away from their locations. Wrong Turn 4 traps its characters in an abandoned sanatorium during a blizzard and refuses to let anyone out, including the script logic. The abandoned hospital is called the Glenville Sanatorium within the story, but its physical presence comes from the former Brandon Mental Health Center in Manitoba. That distinction is important because horror locations often become more powerful when they exist somewhere between reality and fiction. You can tell yourself that Glenville is imaginary, but the corridors you are looking at were real. The doors were real. The institutional geometry was real. The age of the building was real. The filmmakers were not inventing the idea of a place where people had been isolated and confined. They were using a real structure whose history already carried associations with institutional life. You can feel that history without knowing every detail of it. The corridors are too long. The ceilings are too high. The rooms seem to repeat. The walls have a tired institutional color that feels designed for function rather than comfort. And that is exactly what a slasher needs. A good horror location should make you understand how someone could get lost. Wrong Turn 4 gives you a building where you can lose track of which direction you are facing almost immediately. The film repeatedly uses corridors, staircases, balconies, kitchens, offices, cells, basements, and exterior paths to create a network of danger. The geography is not always perfectly logical, but psychologically it works because every doorway becomes a question. Is there somebody behind it? Is this the way out? Is this the room where the others are hiding? Is this the place the killers are watching from? The building turns simple movement into suspense. And snow intensifies that effect. In a forest, you can run in almost any direction, at least theoretically. In a building, movement is organized. You have to use doors. You have to use stairs. You have to pass through bottlenecks. You can be cornered. You can be watched from above. You can be trapped below. The architecture creates the chase before the killers even appear. This is spatial containment, and it is one of the strongest things Wrong Turn 4 understands. The movie does not have a huge budget for spectacle, so it creates spectacle through restriction. The world gets smaller, not bigger. Every escape route disappears. First the storm prevents easy travel. Then the snowmobiles become useless. Then the killers manipulate the building. Then the survivors divide themselves. Then the group begins making decisions based on incomplete information. That is how a pressure cooker works. You do not need more ingredients. You need to increase the heat. With that freezing, decaying asylum built as our arena, let's unlock the doors and let the victims walk right into the trap. The group of young people who enter the sanatorium are, in the most affectionate possible sense, familiar. They are attractive. They are young. They are sexually active. They tease one another. They argue. They make decisions that immediately look questionable from the safety of your couch. In other words, they are slasher characters. If you have watched enough horror, you know their grammar before they speak. The confident one. The responsible one. The couple. The flirt. The skeptic. The person who seems likely to survive. The person whose death is practically highlighted by the camera. This predictability is usually criticized as lazy writing, and honestly, sometimes it is. Wrong Turn 4 is not a movie you watch for subtle character construction. But there is another way to understand these archetypes, and it has everything to do with comfort. Familiar horror characters are narrative furniture. You know where they belong. You know how they behave. You know what kinds of mistakes they make. And that familiarity can actually make a slasher more relaxing. You do not have to spend half the movie learning the social structure of the group. You understand it almost instantly. Jenna and Vincent are sexually involved. Sara and Bridget are a couple. Kenia is more skeptical and practical. Kyle is positioned as one of the more capable members of the group. Lauren is connected to the mythology of the sanatorium. Daniel, Claire, and the others fill out the ensemble. The movie gives you enough information to know who belongs to whom, then immediately begins dismantling that structure. That is the rhythm of the slasher. Build a temporary social world, then destroy it piece by piece. And because this is a prequel, there is an extra layer of inevitability. You already know that the 3 cannibals survive. That means suspense cannot come from asking whether the villains will be defeated. Instead, the tension comes from how the victims will be eliminated and how cruelly the film will do it. This is one of the strange pleasures of prequel horror. The destination is already known, so the entertainment moves into the details. You are not waiting for the question to be answered. You are waiting to see what kind of answer the movie invents. And Wrong Turn 4 is very comfortable with that arrangement. It treats the young characters almost like pieces in a board game. Put them in a room. Separate them. Give them a clue. Remove their escape route. Introduce a weapon. Split the group again. Then let the monsters move. It is not subtle, but it is efficient. And efficiency matters in a movie like this. There is another reason these characters can feel comforting, though, especially if you watched the movie when you were 16 or 17. They belong to a version of youth that was extremely recognizable in early 2010s horror. They are not quite the polished social media generation we now associate with young people on screen. They exist before smartphones became the universal storytelling device that can solve or complicate every plot. They can be isolated without the movie having to invent elaborate technological excuses. Their world feels slightly disconnected from ours. That gives the film an accidental period quality. You can watch it now and see a group of young adults who seem to belong to a pre-streaming, pre-TikTok, pre-everything on-demand version of youth culture. That may not have been intentional, but nostalgia rarely requires intention. Sometimes a movie becomes a time capsule simply because it captures ordinary behavior before that behavior changes. And then there are the villains. Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye are already icons within the logic of the franchise. Their names are ridiculous. Their designs are grotesque. Their behavior is monstrous. But the prequel asks us to look at them before they become the creatures we recognize. In 1974, the young versions of the brothers are institutionalized patients at Glenville Sanatorium. The opening sequence shows them as children trapped within a system that sees them primarily as problems to be contained. That immediately introduces a more complicated question than the series normally asks. What happened to these people before they became killers? Were they born monsters? Were they created by abuse? Did the institution fail them? Did they fail themselves? Or is the movie simply trying to make its villains more interesting by giving them a tragic backstory? The answer is deliberately messy. And that messiness is valuable because it changes the emotional framing of the monsters without making them innocent. The young Hillicker brothers are victims of institutional confinement, but the film does not use that fact to excuse what they eventually become. Instead, it builds a crude origin myth around them. They escape, violence erupts, and the institution collapses into chaos. The brothers discover that the world outside their cell offers a different kind of power. Inside, they are controlled. Outside, they can control. That is a classic horror transformation. The victim becomes the predator. The powerless become powerful through violence. And once the brothers understand that violence works, the franchise mythology can begin. The interesting part is that the movie does not need to make them psychologically realistic. They are folklore figures. They are the kind of monsters that become more believable when their origins are exaggerated. Think of the difference between a person and a campfire story about a person. A person has contradictions. A legend has patterns. Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye are becoming legends. Their deformities, their cannibalism, their institutionalization, and their family bond all contribute to a mythology that exists somewhere between tragedy and exploitation. You can criticize the film for simplifying disability and mental illness into horror imagery, and that criticism is fair. The movie absolutely belongs to a tradition that uses institutions as shorthand for madness and danger. But you can also recognize what it is trying to do within the franchise. It wants the monsters to feel like a family. It wants their violence to have continuity. It wants the audience to understand that these are not random killers who appeared because the plot needed villains. They have history. They have rituals. They have a shared identity. That becomes especially important later because the brothers do not behave like three unrelated monsters. They operate as a unit. They watch each other's backs. They communicate without needing long explanations. They understand the building. They know where the victims are likely to go. In other words, they have home field advantage. And that is what transforms the movie from a simple monster hunt into a territorial war. The young people think they have found shelter. The cannibals know they have entered somebody else's house. The audience knows this, too, but the characters do not. That dramatic irony is the engine of the first half. The characters walk deeper into the trap while believing they are moving toward safety. That is one of the oldest horror structures in existence, and it still works because safety is one of the strongest emotional promises a location can make. A hospital should mean help. A shelter should mean protection. A locked room should mean security. Wrong Turn 4 turns all three ideas inside out. The hospital is where the monsters live. The shelter is the trap. The locked room can become a cage. This is where the movie's simple themes become more interesting than its reputation suggests. It is obsessed with failed institutions. The sanatorium was supposed to contain the brothers, but it could not. The young people rely on the building for protection, but it cannot protect them. They rely on one another, but panic destroys their coordination. They rely on technology, but the snowmobiles fail. They rely on the possibility that somebody will come looking for them, but isolation makes rescue feel almost mythical. Everything that is supposed to create safety fails. That is bleak, but it is also perfectly suited to the survival horror genre. Now consider what happens when the movie moves from character mythology into physical craft, because this is where Wrong Turn 4 genuinely earns more respect than its screenplay sometimes deserves. The kills in this movie crossed a line even for the Wrong Turn franchise. We need to talk about the snowmobile wire sequence, because its logistics are genuinely terrifying. But the more revealing thing is that the film's violence works best when it feels physical. O'Brien has said that the production leaned heavily toward practical effects, with roughly 90% of the effects work done physically and computer-generated imagery used more sparingly, including for things like snow enhancement and blood work. That choice matters. Low-budget horror has always had a strange relationship with physicality. A big studio movie can create almost anything digitally, but digital possibility does not automatically create tactile fear. Sometimes the opposite happens. When a body is obviously computer-generated, your brain recognizes the separation between the image and the thing being represented. A practical effect, even an imperfect one, can occupy the same visual world as the actor. It can catch light in the same way. It can cast a shadow. It can have texture. It can look disgusting because it looks like an object that could actually be sitting in the room. Wrong Turn 4 understands that instinctively. The gore is often the place where the movie stops looking cheap and starts looking handcrafted. That is not the same thing as saying every effect is convincing. Some are clearly limited. Some shots are edited around their weaknesses. Some digital touches have aged more noticeably than the prosthetics. But there is a creative confidence in the practical violence. The filmmakers know that the audience is not expecting subtlety. They are expecting the movie to commit. The barbed wire death is not merely a plot event. It is a demonstration of mechanical cruelty. The wire becomes a weapon because the building contains the materials required to turn everyday objects into instruments of murder. That is an important part of the franchise's identity. The cannibals do not need futuristic technology. They need rope, wire, blades, tools, and a willingness to use them. The infamous fondue sequence takes that principle to an almost absurd extreme. It is grotesque, theatrical, and deliberately difficult to forget. A victim is treated less like a person than like a piece of meat being prepared for consumption, and the scene transforms cannibalism from something implied into something almost culinary. That is why the sequence works as an example of the movie's overall philosophy. If the story is thin, the death has to be memorable. If the dialogue is clumsy, the practical effect needs to give you something to talk about afterward. If the characters are disposable, their exits become the emotional punctuation marks. The film is not hiding its priorities. It is saying, very plainly, that this is a gore movie. And there is something refreshing about that honesty. The production also benefited from the location in ways that a more expensive movie might not have. Instead of constructing elaborate sets, the filmmakers could spend their energy transforming real spaces with relatively small interventions. A corridor could become a murder corridor. A kitchen could become a butcher shop. A medical room could become a torture chamber. A staircase could become a vertical killing zone. The same building could look completely different depending on lighting, blocking, and what the characters know at that moment. This is budgetary ingenuity disguised as atmosphere. A limited budget can force filmmakers to become spatially creative. You cannot blow up the entire building, so you find a hallway that looks threatening. You cannot create a huge digital monster army, so you hide 3 killers in the darkness and let the audience imagine what might be around the next corner. You cannot shoot everywhere, so you make the location feel endless by refusing to establish the full geography at once. Constraint becomes style. That is one of the most important things to understand about direct-to-video horror. The cheapness is not always something that exists in opposition to the aesthetic. Sometimes the aesthetic emerges from the cheapness. A movie made quickly and inexpensively may have fewer options, but fewer options can produce concentration. Wrong Turn 4 is strongest when it behaves like a pressure cooker. It does not need to show us the entire outside world. It needs to make the inside world feel inescapable. The snow is not merely scenery. It is negative space. It surrounds the building with emptiness. The white landscape becomes almost abstract, especially at night, and that abstraction makes the asylum feel like it has been cut out of normal geography. There is no reassuring city skyline. There are no streetlights. There is no passing traffic. There is no ordinary human life visible beyond the walls. The characters are effectively floating in a frozen pocket of nowhere. That is why the exterior scenes can be just as unsettling as the interiors. In the forest, there should be freedom. Here, there is only exposure. The characters are visible against the snow. Their bodies lose heat. Their tracks can betray where they have been. Their transportation can be disabled. Their surroundings can kill them even before the monsters arrive. The environment becomes another antagonist. And then there is the sound. If you remember early 2010s direct-to-video horror, you probably remember the music before you remember the score. The era loved aggressive metal, industrial textures, distorted guitars, pounding percussion, and sudden bursts of noise designed to make a trailer-ready moment feel larger. Wrong Turn 4 fits comfortably inside that tradition. The soundtrack does not always distinguish itself through elaborate melodic themes. Instead, it often works by reinforcing the physicality of the movie. When the characters run, the music pushes. When violence arrives, the sound design becomes sharper. When the building goes quiet, the absence of music suddenly becomes meaningful. That contrast matters more than the individual tracks. Horror is often most effective when sound creates a gap between what you see and what you fear. A scream tells you something happened. Silence makes you wonder what is about to happen. In a snowbound movie, silence has an especially strange quality because snow itself seems to absorb the world. There is no ordinary urban noise. No engines unless the characters start the snowmobiles. No traffic. No distant conversations. The environment feels muffled. That makes the interior noises feel enormous. A door opening. Footsteps. A metal object scraping against a surface. A body hitting the floor. The sound of machinery. The sudden roar of a snowmobile. These noises become disproportionately important because the baseline is quiet. And this is where the movie's industrial aesthetic becomes almost accidental poetry. The aggressive music belongs to the era. The silence belongs to the location. Put them together and you get the sound of 2011 horror trying to reconcile two traditions. One is the loud, rebellious, music video-influenced horror of the late 1990s and 2000s. The other is the older tradition of atmospheric isolation, where silence itself is the weapon. Wrong Turn 4 is not always sophisticated enough to control that tension perfectly, but when it does, the result is effective. The music sets the pulse racing in the dark. But once the traps start closing, the soundtrack gives way to something much more primal: silence, snow, and screaming. And then the structure starts tightening. The group enters the asylum thinking they have found refuge. They settle in. They behave like normal young people. They assume the danger is outside. Then the movie reveals that the danger has been inside all along. Vincent wanders away and discovers the first signs that something is wrong. His death establishes the basic rule: curiosity has a price. Then the group realizes he is missing. They search. That search introduces them to the building as a puzzle. They are not just looking for a friend anymore. They are looking for information. What is this place? Who else is here? Why does the building feel occupied? Why are there signs of recent activity? Why is there a body? Why does the environment seem to have its own hidden logic? The horror escalates because knowledge becomes dangerous. The more they understand, the more frightened they become. But they cannot stop looking because uncertainty is also dangerous. This is a classic survival problem. If you stay still, you may die. If you move, you may die faster. The film repeatedly forces the characters into that contradiction. They try to escape, but the snow and disabled snowmobiles prevent them. They try to barricade themselves, but the building has too many entrances. They try to confront the killers, but the killers understand the space better. They try to split up, which creates new vulnerabilities. They try to stay together, which makes them easier to track. There is no perfect choice. That is where panic becomes more important than intelligence. And this is the point where the movie's simplistic character writing actually serves its structure. You do not need every character to be psychologically deep if the group dynamics are clear. You need to know who will argue, who will act, who will freeze, who will take risks, and who will assume they can solve the problem. The audience begins making predictions. You start thinking, do not go there. Do not separate. Do not open that door. Do not assume the killers are trapped. Do not go into the basement. And then the movie waits just long enough for somebody to make exactly the wrong decision. Pause for a second. Would you actually survive 30 minutes locked in an abandoned asylum during a blizzard with 3 homicidal locals? Be honest. Most of us would like to imagine that we would be the smart survivor who keeps calm, studies the building, organizes everyone, and finds the exit. In reality, panic is contagious. People argue. People misread information. People make emotional decisions. People protect the wrong person. People freeze. People run toward noise instead of away from it. The movie understands that survival is not simply a test of bravery. It is a test of coordination. The group starts with numbers on its side. Then the numbers shrink. Once that happens, every disagreement becomes more dangerous. Every resource becomes more valuable. Every mistake becomes irreversible. The killers, meanwhile, have the advantage of patience. They do not need to escape. They live here. That changes the entire power dynamic. The students are visitors. The brothers are residents. The students are improvising. The brothers are hunting. The students think the building is shelter. The brothers think it is territory. That is the central spatial idea of the film, and it gives the violence a little more thematic weight than you might expect. This is not simply 3 monsters chasing 10 victims through a random building. It is a territorial conflict in which one group does not realize that it has violated the boundaries of another. That does not make the cannibals sympathetic, but it does make their behavior internally coherent. They are protecting a world they have built around themselves, however monstrous that world is. The victims are intruders. The intruders become prey. And because this is a prequel, we know the brothers will eventually leave this place and become the monsters of the earlier movies. The asylum is not merely their home. It is their origin point. That makes every corridor feel like part of a mythology being written in real time. The film also has a nasty sense of inevitability because the audience knows exactly what happens to the villains later. There is no possibility that the students will permanently defeat them. So the movie can spend its energy making the route toward the inevitable as cruel as possible. Claire's death is a good example. The group believes they can get out. The killers demonstrate that they can attack from above and use the building itself against them. The barbed wire becomes a visual expression of the trap. It is not enough to kill someone. The film wants the survivors to witness the death and understand that the building has become hostile territory. That is the real function of a slasher kill. It is communication. The killer is telling the survivors what they are capable of. The more creative the death, the more information the audience receives about the threat. A simple stabbing says the killer can stab. A trap says the killer plans ahead. A death involving the environment says the environment itself can be weaponized. Wrong Turn 4 repeatedly escalates along those lines. The victims become increasingly aware that they are not simply being chased. They are being manipulated. The killers are taking their resources. They remove spark plug wires. They use the asylum's architecture. They hide in spaces the victims do not understand. They separate people. They exploit moments of confusion. The violence becomes a game of information. And that is where the movie's pacing becomes surprisingly disciplined. It is not elegant, but it rarely allows the pressure to disappear for long. One death leads to a discovery. The discovery leads to a plan. The plan creates another vulnerability. The vulnerability produces another death. That chain keeps the film moving. A more expensive movie might have spent more time developing subplots. Wrong Turn 4 instead keeps tightening the same knot. This is why its simplicity can be mistaken for stupidity. The plot is simple because the structure is designed around escalation. On the surface, it is teenagers running from mutated hillbillies. Look closer, and it becomes a grim little parable about institutional failure and tribal vengeance. The movie does not articulate that theme through speeches, and honestly, it would probably become less effective if it tried. It expresses the idea through the mechanics of survival. The institution failed to contain the brothers. The new arrivals fail to understand the institution. The group fails to maintain its social order. Every structure collapses under pressure. And once those structures collapse, the oldest structure remains: family. The brothers stay together. Their victims scatter. That contrast is quietly important. The cannibals are grotesque, but they are coordinated. The young people are normal, but they are fragmented. The movie is essentially asking whether civilization has any advantage when the environment becomes hostile and the rules disappear. Its answer is not especially optimistic. The people who survive are the ones who can adapt fastest. That is one reason the film feels so nihilistic. There is very little sense that justice is coming. There is no larger moral order correcting the situation. There is only survival, and even survival is temporary. The audience knows that the monsters will continue existing. So the movie's emotional horizon is intentionally bleak. But there is a strange comfort in that bleakness when you watch it as an adult. Because the rules are so simple. The world outside the screen may be complicated, exhausting, and full of problems that cannot be solved in 90 minutes. Wrong Turn 4 offers a simpler nightmare. Find shelter. Stay together. Do not trust the building. Do not get caught. Run. Hide. Fight. Survive. There is something almost soothing about that clarity. When you were younger, you might have watched the movie for adrenaline. Years later, you can watch it and recognize the comfort of a threat that has boundaries. The monster is visible. The danger has a location. The story has an ending. Real life rarely offers that kind of closure. That is part of why trash horror can become comfort food. You know exactly what flavor you are getting. You know the calories are terrible. You know the presentation is questionable. You still order it because sometimes you want something immediate. That is Wrong Turn 4's appeal. It is cinematic junk food, but junk food can still be culturally meaningful. And that brings us to the critical reception, because this is where the divide between the movie's reputation and its cult appeal becomes especially interesting. If you approach Wrong Turn 4 expecting polished character work, sophisticated dialogue, or prestige horror, there is a lot to dislike. The acting can be uneven. The screenplay is blunt. Some character decisions exist primarily because the plot needs another person in danger. The mythology is exploitative. The visual effects are not uniformly convincing. The film's sexuality can feel less like character development and more like a traditional slasher mechanism for establishing vulnerability. These are legitimate criticisms. You do not need to pretend the movie is secretly Kubrick to enjoy it. In fact, pretending that would weaken the argument. The more interesting position is to admit that Wrong Turn 4 is often bad in recognizable ways while also asking why so many horror fans continue to find it entertaining. Contemporary critical reactions were mixed to negative, and aggregate scores have reflected that divide. Yet later horror commentary has repeatedly singled out the practical effects, the location, the unusual deaths, and the film's willingness to embrace its own nastiness. One critic can watch the same scene and see juvenile exploitation. Another can watch it and see exactly the kind of ridiculous gorehound entertainment they wanted from the franchise. Neither reaction is inherently dishonest. They are measuring different things. Mainstream criticism often asks whether a movie succeeds according to standards of narrative sophistication, performance, thematic depth, and cinematic originality. DTV horror audiences often ask a different question: did this thing deliver? Did it scare me? Did it gross me out? Did it have memorable kills? Did it give me enough atmosphere to justify the rental? Did I have fun? Those are not lesser questions. They are simply genre-specific questions. Critical dismissal versus midnight fandom exposes how mainstream critics can misunderstand DTV horror economics. A movie designed to serve a niche audience should not necessarily be judged as though it were attempting to serve everyone. Wrong Turn 4 knows its audience. The question is whether you are willing to meet it halfway. If you are, the movie starts revealing little details that become surprisingly lovable. The real location. The practical effects. The winter setting. The speed. The audacity of certain kills. The absurdity of the mythology. The sheer commitment to making everything colder, bloodier, and nastier than it needs to be. That commitment is part of the charm. There is a particular kind of confidence in a movie that says, yes, we know the third movie was not enough. Here is an abandoned asylum. Here are 3 cannibals. Here is a blizzard. Here is a fondue sequence. Here is a snowmobile chase. Here is barbed wire. Enjoy. That is not high art. But it is a recognizable artistic philosophy. Give the audience the thing they came for, and give it to them with enough enthusiasm that they remember the experience. The film's reception also changed in the years after release because the media environment changed. In 2011, a direct-to-video horror movie could feel disposable almost by definition. Today, the same movie can be rediscovered through streaming, social media clips, horror podcasts, retrospective channels, and online communities dedicated to forgotten genre films. The internet has become an enormous archaeological site for movies that once seemed destined to disappear. A film can fail to matter to mainstream culture and still become important to a specific group of viewers. That is how cult status works. It is not always about universal admiration. Sometimes it is about persistence. A movie survives because somebody keeps talking about it. Somebody remembers the kill. Somebody makes a ranking. Somebody uploads a review. Somebody asks whether it is actually the best sequel. Somebody who watched it at 16 becomes the adult who writes a paragraph about why it still works. Suddenly the disposable movie is no longer disposable. It has entered memory. And memory is where Wrong Turn 4 becomes most interesting. Because you did not love this movie because it won Oscars. You loved it because it felt dangerous, unauthorized, and entirely yours. Maybe you watched it when you were too young. Maybe you watched it when your parents thought you were sleeping. Maybe you watched it with friends and spent more time laughing than screaming. Maybe you hated it and still remember it vividly. Maybe you found it years later and wondered why anyone had bothered making a fourth wrong turn. The specific reaction does not matter as much as the fact that the movie became attached to a moment in your life. That is what nostalgia actually does. It does not necessarily tell you that something was great. It tells you that something was there. It marks a time. It preserves a texture. And for people who grew up during the late 2000s and early 2010s horror boom, cheap genre movies were everywhere. They filled shelves. They filled cable schedules. They filled online recommendation threads. They gave young viewers an enormous unofficial curriculum in what horror could be. You could move from Scream to Saw to Final Destination to The Descent to Wrong Turn to a movie you had never heard of with a cover featuring a woman screaming beside a chainsaw. You could learn the entire taxonomy of the genre without ever taking a film class. You learned that the final girl behaves differently from the first victim. You learned that abandoned buildings are never empty. You learned that if someone says they know a shortcut, the movie is about to punish them. You learned that the monster does not always need a supernatural explanation. Sometimes it is simply a person who lives beyond the road. And eventually, you learned that horror itself could become comfort. This is why the phrase guilty pleasure has always bothered me a little. It suggests that enjoying a lowbrow movie is something you need to apologize for. But why? You can recognize flaws and still enjoy something. You can criticize a movie and still love it. Those positions are not contradictory. In fact, they are often more honest than either extreme. The horror fan in you remembers a brutal, snow-soaked thrill ride. The objective critic sees cheap lighting and wooden acting. The truth is that the cheapness is the aesthetic. The limitations are part of the experience. If you polished every rough edge, replaced every practical effect with expensive digital imagery, gave every character a carefully researched psychological arc, and photographed every corridor with immaculate prestige horror lighting, you might create a better movie by conventional standards. But you would also create a different movie. You would lose the strange texture that made this one feel like a DVD-era artifact. The imperfections are evidence of its production history. They show you where the money went. They reveal what the filmmakers prioritized. The gore receives attention. The location receives attention. The pacing receives attention. Character nuance receives less. That is not accidental. It is the economic DNA of the film. And once you see that, the movie becomes a fascinating little case study in how direct-to-video filmmaking works. You can almost reverse engineer the budget from the screen. Find one spectacular location. Keep the cast contained. Shoot quickly. Use practical effects wherever they will be visible. Add digital enhancements where necessary. Build the marketing around the kills. Deliver a recognizable franchise title. Release it in time for the seasonal horror market. The production was reportedly completed in only 19 days, which makes the finished film more impressive from a craft perspective. 19 days is not a lot of time to create 93 minutes of horror involving a large ensemble, snowmobile sequences, practical gore, stunts, and a substantial location. It means the crew had to be efficient. It means the filmmakers could not spend endless days perfecting every setup. It means certain roughness was inevitable. But it also means that every successful moment represents a logistical victory. The fondue scene had to be designed, staged, lit, performed, and captured. The hanging sequence reportedly took an entire shooting day. The snowmobile material had to be coordinated in freezing conditions. O'Brien even described the weather as reaching roughly -45 degrees on one night of shooting. That cold is not something you can fake emotionally. Actors are performing in an environment that physically affects them. Breath, snow, clothing, movement, visibility, and timing all become part of the image. You can see the production fighting the weather and benefiting from it at the same time. The cold makes everything look more dangerous, but it also makes filmmaking harder. That tension becomes part of the movie's texture. The film's greatest technical achievement may therefore be its ability to turn production limitations into narrative atmosphere. It is not beautiful in the conventional sense, but it has a visual personality. The blue-white exterior. The brown and gray interior. The red of blood against snow. The harsh artificial light of institutional rooms. The darkness of corridors. These colors repeat until the film feels almost monochromatic, interrupted by violence. Blood becomes a visual punctuation mark. Against the pale environment, it demands attention. The effect is almost graphic novel-like without becoming stylized in the polished sense. It feels accidental, but accident can be powerful when the elements align. This is why the movie can occasionally look like a painting, as O'Brien himself suggested when discussing the snowmobile material and cinematographer Michael Marshall's lighting. The beautiful image followed by something horrible is a familiar horror strategy, but here the contrast is unusually stark. Snow is beautiful. Snow is also deadly. The hospital is visually fascinating. It is also a slaughterhouse. The young people are attractive and energetic. They are also bodies waiting for the next set piece. The movie constantly places beauty next to ugliness. That contrast is one of the reasons the imagery sticks. And then, right in the middle of the carnage, the film does something bizarrely theatrical that shifts the entire tone of the survivor group. The survivors begin to understand that ordinary rules no longer apply. They are not waiting for rescue anymore. They are constructing defenses. They are trying to find weapons. They are making choices based on survival rather than morality. That shift is essential. A slasher becomes more compelling when victims stop behaving like victims and start behaving like people under siege. Suddenly the movie has a different rhythm. The group is not simply waiting for the next death. They are trying to create a counterattack. They imprison the brothers. They search for the missing equipment. They attempt to outthink their attackers. And for a brief moment, you can imagine that the humans might actually win. Of course, the prequel structure tells us otherwise. But the illusion of possibility matters. Horror needs temporary hope because without hope there is nothing to destroy. The movie repeatedly builds that hope and then crushes it. When the killers escape, the survivors' plan collapses. When Kyle is accidentally killed because the girls mistake him for one of the brothers, the film reaches one of its bleakest points. The humans are now so frightened that they can no longer reliably identify friend from enemy. That is what prolonged panic does. It destroys perception. It makes every shape in the darkness suspicious. It turns the survivors against themselves. This is where the movie's apparent simplicity becomes psychologically useful. You can see the chain reaction clearly. Fear creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates mistakes. Mistakes create injury. Injury creates more fear. Eventually the group is no longer fighting the original threat alone. They are fighting the consequences of their own panic. That is survival horror in its most basic form. The monster is outside you, but the panic is inside you. And that is why the final stretch feels so relentless. Once the survivors leave the building, you might expect the movie to become easier. Instead, the snow becomes the final trap. Lauren tries to reach help and dies in the cold. The remaining survivors are chased by the cannibals on snowmobiles. The environment opens up, but freedom remains impossible. This is a clever reversal of the building's spatial logic. Inside, the characters are trapped by walls. Outside, they are trapped by distance. Inside, the killers know the corridors. Outside, the killers have mobility. The geography changes, but the power imbalance remains. That is what gives the climax its momentum. You are not watching the characters escape the movie's central problem. You are watching the problem change shape. The snowmobile sequence becomes the physical expression of that change. Earlier, the machines represented escape. Now they represent pursuit. The same technology that could have carried the students to safety becomes another weapon in the killer's hands. That is almost cruelly appropriate. Every tool the characters rely on becomes something the movie can turn against them. And then comes the ending, where the prequel's logic closes the loop. The survivors who have made it this far do not simply ride into the sunset. They encounter another trap, and the film reminds us that there was never going to be a clean victory. The brothers survive because the franchise needs them to survive. But the manner in which the final survivors are defeated still matters because it reinforces the movie's worldview. There is no grand confrontation where evil is punished. There is only the continuation of the cycle. The cannibals collect the aftermath and move on. Their world continues. The victims become evidence. The asylum remains. The mythology moves forward. That ending is not emotionally satisfying in the traditional sense, but it is consistent. Wrong Turn 4 is a movie where survival is temporary and violence is hereditary. The brothers are not defeated because they are part of the franchise's mythology. The young people cannot escape because they are part of the franchise's body count. The structure is circular. That circularity is exactly what the title promises. A wrong turn leads to another wrong turn. The road keeps looping back into danger. The franchise itself operates the same way. One movie creates another. Another sequel arrives. A prequel explains the villains. Another sequel expands the mythology. The characters change, but the machinery remains. That is the anatomy of a cash grab, but it is also the anatomy of a cult franchise. Something has to keep moving. Something has to keep being produced. Something has to keep giving the audience another reason to return. And for a while, Wrong Turn did exactly that. It was not alone. The direct-to-video horror market of the 2000s and early 2010s was full of sequels, spin-offs, remakes, and variations on familiar formulas. The economics encouraged repetition because repetition reduced risk. If the audience already knew the title, the marketing did not have to explain everything from scratch. If the monster already had an identity, the movie could spend its limited resources on spectacle. If the previous film sold enough copies, another one became an obvious business proposition. The result was a huge archive of films that mainstream culture mostly forgot. But forgotten does not mean culturally irrelevant. These movies were watched by millions of people in bedrooms, dorm rooms, basements, and living rooms. They became part of the background noise of adolescence. They taught young viewers what horror could be when nobody was trying to impress anyone outside the genre. That is why looking back at them now can feel surprisingly emotional. You are not only remembering the movie. You are remembering the infrastructure around the movie. The rental kiosk. The DVD shelf. The cable guide. The torrent site. The cheap headphones. The late-night snack. The friend who said, "You have to watch this." The feeling of finding something that had not been approved by the cultural establishment. That feeling was important. It made horror feel like a private club. And direct-to-video movies were often the easiest way into that club. You did not need to understand film history. You needed curiosity. You needed a tolerance for bad acting. You needed a willingness to watch something because the cover looked disgusting. Once you entered, you discovered a whole ecosystem. You found other movies. You found directors. You found effects artists. You found forums. You learned about practical makeup. You learned which sequels were worth watching. You developed taste by watching things you hated. This is an underrated part of genre education. You cannot develop critical judgment without encountering failure. Sometimes the only way to understand why a great horror movie works is to watch 5 mediocre ones that use the same structure badly. Wrong Turn 4 belongs in that curriculum. It shows you what happens when a slasher has a great location but weak character writing. It shows you how practical gore can elevate otherwise ordinary material. It shows you how a prequel can create sympathy without fully earning it. It shows you how repetition can become comfort. It shows you how a low budget can become a visual identity. And it shows you why some movies survive despite being objectively flawed. The answer is not always quality. Sometimes it is personality. Wrong Turn 4 has personality. It is cold. It is mean. It is occasionally ridiculous. It is enthusiastic. It is not embarrassed by the fact that its audience wants blood. That honesty has value. A movie can be clumsy and still have a strong sense of what it wants to be. And what Wrong Turn 4 wants to be is extremely clear. It wants to take the franchise back to its monsters. It wants to put them in a location where they have maximum control. It wants to explain where they came from. It wants to kill a lot of people. It wants the deaths to be memorable. It wants to do all of this quickly and cheaply enough to fit the direct-to-video model. By those standards, it succeeds more often than it fails. That does not make it a masterpiece. It makes it a remarkably efficient genre product. And sometimes efficiency is its own form of craft. Think about the production challenge again. 19 days. A large ensemble. A real abandoned hospital. Freezing weather. Snowmobiles. Practical effects. Multiple death sequences. A prequel storyline. A franchise continuity problem. A fixed release schedule. That is a lot of moving pieces. The finished movie may wobble, but it gets across the finish line. And when you understand the conditions under which it was made, certain choices become more impressive. The film does not have the luxury of wasting time. It has to establish the location quickly. It has to introduce the group quickly. It has to get to the first death. It has to establish the monsters. It has to escalate. It has to end. There is no room for a 20-minute philosophical detour. Everything is compressed into a machine that produces fear and gore. That compression can feel crude, but it can also feel honest. The movie is not pretending to be something else. It is not asking you to admire its restraint. It is asking you to buckle in. That is why the word trash becomes complicated when discussing films like this. Trash can be an insult, but trash can also describe a mode of pleasure. Camp, exploitation, grindhouse, pulp, B-movie, schlock, DTV horror. All of these categories exist because audiences enjoy things that do not fit neatly into conventional ideas of quality. The important question is whether the work knows how to use its limitations. Wrong Turn 4 sometimes does. The location is excellent. The practical effects are often strong. The winter setting gives the franchise a fresh visual identity. The kills have invention. The pacing is aggressive. The prequel structure gives the monsters additional mythology. The sound design creates atmosphere when it gets out of the way. Those strengths coexist with weak dialogue, uneven performances, questionable character logic, and a screenplay that often treats people as pieces of meat. You do not have to choose one side. You can hold both judgments simultaneously. That is what balanced excavation means. We dig through the snow and find the trash, but we also find the craft underneath it. We find the limitations and the clever solutions. We find the ugly parts and the oddly beautiful ones. We find a movie that is less important as a work of art than as evidence of how a particular film culture functioned. And that brings us back to you. When you watched Wrong Turn 4 at 16, you probably were not thinking about production economics. You were not wondering how many shooting days the crew had or why the Brandon location was so effective. You were not analyzing the difference between practical gore and digital enhancement. You were watching a horror movie. You wanted to know who would die next. You wanted to see how disgusting the next kill could get. You wanted to laugh at the ridiculousness. You wanted to feel that tiny jolt of danger that comes from watching something transgressive. That is enough. Your teenage response does not need to be upgraded into an academic argument before it becomes legitimate. But now that you are older, you can return to the same movie and discover another layer. That is the gift of revisiting trash. The movie has not necessarily improved. You have changed. You now understand the context around it. You know what production constraints look like. You know how much work goes into making even a bad movie. You understand why certain locations matter. You recognize genre patterns. You can see where the screenplay cuts corners. You can appreciate when a practical effect actually works. You can separate emotional memory from critical evaluation without destroying either one. That is a healthier way to engage with nostalgia. Nostalgia does not need to lie. It can say, this movie is flawed, and I still love it. It can say, this scene is ridiculous, and I still remember exactly where I was when I saw it. It can say, the acting is not great, but the atmosphere works. It can say, the story is simple, but the location is incredible. It can say, I would never call this high art, but it belongs to my cinematic DNA. And that last phrase is really the heart of the whole thing. We inherit our movie tastes from everywhere. From parents. From friends. From television. From theaters. From libraries. From DVDs. From strangers online. Sometimes the movies that shape us are the ones nobody intended to preserve. A studio may think of a film as a product designed to generate sales for one weekend in October. A teenager may experience that same film as an introduction to an entire genre. The studio moves on. The teenager grows up. The movie stays in memory. That is how cultural artifacts survive. Wrong Turn 4 is therefore worth more than its reputation suggests, but not because it deserves to be elevated into a masterpiece. It is worth examining because it shows us what a particular kind of horror looked like at a particular moment. It captures the final years of a physical media culture. It captures the economics of franchise continuation. It captures the practical effects revival happening alongside increasingly digital filmmaking. It captures the aesthetics of early 2010s genre cinema. It captures the appeal of isolation during an era when audiences were still consuming horror through cable, DVDs, and downloaded files. And it captures something even more personal, the feeling of being young and discovering movies outside the approved canon. So where does that leave us? We have a critically reviled sequel and a fiercely loyal late-night fanbase. It is time to weigh the two against the cold reality of the screen. The horror fan in you remembers a brutal, snow-soaked thrill ride. The objective critic sees cheap lighting and wooden acting. Both are correct. Wrong Turn 4 is not a great film in the traditional sense. Its dialogue is often painfully direct. Its characters are functional rather than deeply developed. Its treatment of mental illness and deformity is uncomfortable and rooted in familiar horror stereotypes. Its prequel mythology does not always withstand close scrutiny. Some effects have aged better than others. Some moments are unintentionally funny. The film can be exploitative, juvenile, and crude. But here is the thing, none of those criticisms erase the fact that it is exceptionally committed to its specific genre purpose. It has an excellent horror location. It has a strong sense of physical geography. It uses winter intelligently. It gives its killers a home field advantage that creates real structural tension. It features practical gore that remains memorable more than a decade later. It understands that a death scene can be a piece of spectacle. It understands that silence can make a location feel larger. It understands that repetition is not always the enemy of suspense. And it understands the audience. That last point matters more than it seems. The movie knows that you already understand the rules. It knows you know the brothers will survive. It knows you can identify the disposable characters. It knows you are waiting for the next kill. Instead of pretending otherwise, it accelerates the machinery. There is almost a punk quality to that directness. It is not interested in proving that the slasher is intellectually respectable. It is interested in proving that the slasher can still be fun. That is why the practical effects matter so much. The physical gore gives the movie an objecthood. You can feel the rubber, the prosthetics, the blood, the tools, the cold. The effects are not always seamless, but they are present. They occupy the same world as the actors. They remind you that somebody physically built this nightmare. In an age when digital imagery can create almost anything, there is something charming about a movie that still relies on people standing behind a camera trying to make a fake death look disgusting. That craft deserves respect even when the final product is messy. The same is true of the location. Finding an abandoned mental health facility that perfectly fit the script was a stroke of production luck, but recognizing its potential was also a creative decision. The filmmakers could have treated the building as background. Instead, they made it the central character. The building creates the routes. The routes create the traps. The traps create the kills. The kills create the pacing. That chain is the film's real achievement. It takes a cheap premise and gives it a strong physical container. You can feel the movie getting better whenever it stops talking and starts moving through space. The corridors do more storytelling than some of the dialogue. The snow does more storytelling than some of the exposition. The practical effects do more emotional work than some of the character development. That tells you where the filmmakers were strongest. And perhaps that is the fairest way to judge a movie. Do not ask it to be something it never intended to be. Ask what it attempts, then judge how well it attempts it. Wrong Turn 4 attempts to be a nasty, fast, isolated, practical effects-driven slasher. It attempts to give a familiar franchise a new environment. It attempts to make its villains feel like a family. It attempts to create memorable deaths. It attempts to exploit a real abandoned location. It attempts to keep the audience moving from one piece of danger to another. On those terms, it succeeds. Not perfectly. Not elegantly. But often effectively. And that is why I think the movie deserves a more generous kind of criticism. Not praise for things that are bad, but attention to the things that work. There is a difference between saying a movie is good and saying a movie is interesting. Wrong Turn 4 is interesting. It is interesting as a production artifact. It is interesting as a franchise prequel. It is interesting as a DTV horror film. It is interesting as an example of practical effects. It is interesting as a piece of early 2010s media culture. And it is interesting because people remember it. That memory is not an accident. Something about the film connected. Maybe it was the snow. Maybe it was the asylum. Maybe it was the kills. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity. Maybe it was simply the fact that you watched it at exactly the right age. We underestimate how much timing affects taste. The movie you discover at 12 is not the same movie you discover at 30. The movie you discover during a lonely winter is not the same movie you discover during a summer vacation. The movie you watch with friends is not the same movie you watch alone. Context changes cinema because context changes us. That is why revisiting Wrong Turn 4 can feel like opening an old drawer and finding a photograph you forgot you kept. The image itself may not be extraordinary. The memory attached to it is. You see the DVD cover and suddenly remember the room. You hear the opening music and remember being awake at an unreasonable hour. You see the snow and remember the strange comfort of being terrified by something that could only happen inside a movie. That is nostalgia at its healthiest. It does not say the past was better. It says the past was yours. And that is why gritty, forgotten sequels matter to our cinematic DNA. They are the movies that filled the spaces between the classics. They taught us how genre works before we had the vocabulary to explain it. They gave us examples of bad writing, good effects, strange performances, inventive kills, awkward sexuality, questionable morality, and unforgettable atmosphere. They made us critics before we knew we were becoming critics. You watched something and thought, that was terrible. Then you watched another and thought, that was awesome. Then you watched a third and realized you could explain why. That is film literacy. It does not have to begin with Citizen Kane. Sometimes it begins with a snowmobile, an abandoned asylum, and 3 cannibal brothers. Wrong Turn 4 is not a masterpiece of horror. But it is a surprisingly pure expression of what direct-to-video horror could be when all the machinery is visible. It is cheap enough that you can see the constraints. It is ambitious enough that you can see the solutions. It is derivative enough that you can map its genre DNA. It is violent enough that you can understand why audiences came back. And it is specific enough that, 15 years later, people still know exactly which movie you mean when you say the one with the fondue scene. That kind of memorability matters. Plenty of expensive movies disappear. Plenty of acclaimed movies become footnotes. A low-budget sequel with an abandoned hospital can survive because one sequence sticks in the mind. One image becomes a recommendation. One recommendation becomes a viewing. One viewing becomes a memory. One memory becomes a cult. That is how the archive grows. And maybe that is the most generous way to understand the direct-to-video era. It was not simply a dumping ground for movies that were not good enough for theaters. It was an alternative distribution ecosystem where filmmakers could make genre films for audiences who already knew what they wanted. Some were awful. Some were brilliant. Most were somewhere in between. But together they created a parallel history of cinema. A history made from rental shelves, DVD menus, cable marathons, midnight discoveries, and movies that never received the cultural respect they deserved or, perhaps more importantly, never needed it. Wrong Turn 4 belongs there. It is a little ugly. It is a little ridiculous. It is sometimes genuinely nasty. It is also atmospheric, tactile, efficient, and surprisingly thoughtful about space. The cheapness is real, but the cheapness is not the whole story. The objective flaws are real, but they are not the whole experience. The nostalgia is real, but nostalgia is not a critical argument. Put all 3 together, and you get something more useful than either worship or dismissal. You get perspective. You can say, yes, this movie is trash. And then you can ask what kind of trash it is, why it works when it works, why it fails when it fails, and why you still remember it. That is the question that matters. Because eventually, every movie becomes a memory. The prestige dramas. The blockbusters. The childhood cartoons. The cheap slashers. The forgotten sequels. Time flattens the hierarchy. What remains is what you carried with you. And for a certain generation of horror fans, Wrong Turn 4 is one of those strange little things we carried forward without realizing it. We started with that flickering DVD menu. Now that we have dug through the snow, you can see it was not just a cheap sequel. It was a time capsule. It preserved a moment when horror could still feel like something you discovered rather than something an algorithm delivered. It preserved the look of early digital filmmaking, the sound of aggressive genre music, the tactile ugliness of practical gore, and the strange freedom of a franchise that had already abandoned any hope of being respectable. Most importantly, it preserved a feeling. That midnight thrill is real. The room is dark. The television is glowing. Everyone else is asleep. You know the movie is probably ridiculous, but you press play anyway. The first image appears. The snow begins to fall. Somewhere inside an abandoned building, something moves. And for the next 90 minutes, nothing outside the screen matters quite as much. That is why your nostalgia makes sense. It is okay to still love this. Not because it is secretly perfect, but because it gave you something movies are very good at giving us, a place to go for a while. Wrong Turn 4 gave a generation of young horror fans a frozen maze, a handful of disposable characters, 3 unforgettable monsters, and enough blood to make the whole thing impossible to forget. Maybe that is not a masterpiece. Maybe it is something stranger. Maybe it is a small, ugly, beautifully preserved piece of cinematic archaeology. And sometimes, when you dig far enough into the snow, that is exactly what you were hoping to find.
I'm sure he just fell asleep. Smoke pretty heavy.
Stone right now in the corner. We're having a bad trip somewhere.
Did you guys find anything?
Yeah.
What? Yeah. What? Porter's jacket. That looks like. I want to get the hell out of here. What do you mean? So.
We're not alone here.